The velvet curtains of the Ashford mansion barely muffled the sound of shattering crystal as Victoria Ashford hurled the glass against the marble fireplace. Her father, Richard Ashford, stood frozen in the doorway of his study, his face contorted with a rage that made his carefully cultivated gentleman's facade crumble completely. "You will not do this to me, Victoria. Not after everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to give you the life you have." His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of controlled fury that servants knew to avoid at all costs. Victoria, 17 years old with her mother's delicate features and her father's iron will, lifted her chin defiantly. "Everything you've built was on the backs of people you considered beneath you, father. Everything you've sacrificed was other people's dignity, not your own. This is about her, isn't it? That woman." Richard couldn't bring himself to say the name, as if speaking it would give legitimacy to the bond he had spent years trying to ignore. "Eleanor Chambers, your nanny, has poisoned your mind with her radical ideas about equality and justice." "Eleanor taught me to read before I was 4, Victoria shot back, her voice breaking slightly. "She taught me mathematics, history, literature. She taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account." "What exactly did you teach me, father? How to look down on people, how to measure human value in dollars and social connections." The year was 1925, and the Ashford estate in Connecticut was a monument to old money and older prejudices. Richard Ashford had inherited a banking empire and multiplied it through ruthless business practices and strategic marriages. His wife, Victoria's mother, had died when the girl was only 3 years old, leaving behind a grieving husband who threw himself into work and a daughter who found comfort in the arms of her nanny. Eleanor Chambers had been hired when Victoria was 2, a young black woman from Harlem with an education that surpassed most white men of her generation. Her grandmother had been a slave who learned to read in secret, her mother a teacher who had instilled in Eleanor the belief that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away. When she arrived at the Ashford mansion, she expected to be just another servant, invisible and voiceless. What she hadn't expected was to fall in love with the curious, bright-eyed child placed in her care. And years later, she certainly hadn't expected that child to become the most important person in her life, or that their bond would become so threatening to Richard Ashford's carefully constructed world. "I forbid you to see her again," Richard declared, moving to his desk where a stack of papers awaited his signature. "I've made arrangements. Eleanor will receive a generous severance, enough to start over somewhere far from here. You will attend finishing school in Switzerland, and when you return in 2 years, this foolish rebellion will be forgotten." Victoria's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "And if I refuse?" Richard looked up, his eyes cold. "Then you'll leave this house with nothing. No money, no connections, no future. You'll be just another foolish girl who threw away every advantage for a childish attachment. Is that what you want?" Victoria didn't say. What she couldn't say in that moment was that Eleanor had already made plans. For months, they had been secretly preparing for this confrontation, knowing it was inevitable. Eleanor had saved every penny of her wages for 15 years, and through connections in Harlem's intellectual circles, she had secured positions for both of them at a progressive school in Chicago, a place where a white girl and a black woman working together wouldn't immediately be reported to the authorities. That night, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, Victoria Ashford walked out of her father's mansion for the last time. She carried only a single suitcase with her mother's jewelry hidden in the lining and her most precious books. At the servants' entrance, Eleanor waited with her own modest bag, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "Are you certain?" Eleanor whispered as they hurried through the gardens toward the back gate. "Once we cross that threshold, there's no returning. Your father will never forgive this." Victoria took Eleanor's hand, feeling the calluses from years of work, the strength in fingers that had braided her hair, wiped her tears, and held books steady while teaching her to read. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The journey to Chicago was fraught with dangers they had only partially anticipated. Train conductors who questioned why a white girl traveled with a black woman, hotel clerks who refused them rooms, restaurants that wouldn't serve them at the same table. Each humiliation was a lesson for Victoria, a glimpse into the world Eleanor had navigated her entire life. In Chicago, they found refuge in a boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, a formidable black woman who had made her fortune in real estate and had no patience for society's arbitrary rules. The progressive school that had promised them positions was everything they had hoped for, a place where children of all backgrounds learned together, where ideas mattered more than pedigree. Victoria became Miss Ashford, teacher of literature and art. Eleanor was Miss Chambers, instructor of mathematics and science. They shared a small apartment above a bookstore, living simply but freely, building a life that defied every convention of their time. Years passed. Victoria's hair, once styled in elaborate curls by maids, now fell in a simple bob. Her hands, once soft and useless, grew strong from carrying books and scrubbing floors. Eleanor, freed from the constraints of servitude, flourished intellectually, publishing papers on education theory under a pseudonym, her ideas slowly infiltrating academic circles that would never have accepted them had they known the author's identity. They built something beautiful together, a partnership that transcended the labels society tried to impose. They were teacher and student, yes, but also friends, confidants, and something deeper that neither dared name in an era that had no language for it. Meanwhile, in Connecticut, Richard Ashford descended into an obsessive quest to find his daughter. He hired private investigators, offered rewards, used every connection in his considerable network. But Victoria had disappeared completely, swallowed by a world he didn't understand and couldn't penetrate. His business suffered as his attention wavered. His health declined as guilt and rage consumed him in equal measure. 5 years after Victoria's disappearance, Richard received a letter. It came from a lawyer in Chicago, informing him that his daughter wished to claim her inheritance from her mother's estate, a trust that had matured on her 22nd birthday. The letter included an address. Richard Ashford arrived in Chicago on a gray November morning, his driver navigating the unfamiliar streets with visible discomfort. The address led to a modest neighborhood, nothing like the grand estates he associated with his daughter's rightful place. When he knocked on the door of the apartment above the bookstore, his hands were shaking. Eleanor answered. She was 37 now, her face showing the first lines of age, but her eyes still bright with intelligence and quiet dignity. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, this man who had employed her and this woman who had stolen his daughter. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "Victoria is teaching. She'll return in an hour. Would you like to wait inside?" The apartment was small but immaculate, filled with books and papers, the walls covered with Victoria's paintings and Eleanor's charts of mathematical equations. Richard stood in the center of the modest living room, feeling like a giant in a dollhouse, everything around him a rebuke to the life he had tried to force upon his daughter. When Victoria finally arrived, breathless from climbing the stairs, her arms full of student essays, she stopped short at the sight of her father. 5 years had changed them both. Richard's hair had gone completely gray, his face gaunt. Victoria had lost the softness of youth, her features sharper, her bearing confident in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or privilege. "Father," she said simply, setting down her papers. Richard's carefully prepared speech evaporated. All the anger, all the rehearsed recriminations, disappeared in the face of his daughter's calm gaze. "You look well," he managed finally. "I am well," Victoria replied, "better than I've ever been." The three of them sat awkwardly in the small parlor, teacups balanced on knees, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control. "I came to bring you home. Your room is exactly as you left it. I've arranged for Eleanor to have a position at a school in Hartford, a respectable distance. We can put this behind us." Victoria exchanged a glance with Eleanor, a look of such profound understanding that Richard felt something crack inside his chest. "This is my home, Father. These are my people. This is my life." Richard's face hardened. "You're living in poverty, teaching other people's children for pennies, throwing away your birthright for what exactly?" "For freedom," Victoria said quietly. "For the right to choose my own path. For the privilege of living authentically instead of performing a role in your carefully staged production." "And what role is that?" Richard demanded, his voice rising. "The role of my daughter, the heir to everything I've built." "The heir to a fortune built on exploitation," Victoria replied, her voice steady. "Do you know what I've learned in these 5 years, Father? I've learned that the banks you control deny loans to black families trying to buy homes. I've learned that the factories you invest in pay black workers half what they pay white workers for the same labor. I've learned that your wealth, our wealth, comes from maintaining the very systems that told Eleanor she was less than human." Richard stood abruptly, his face flushed. I won't listen to this socialist nonsense. You've been brainwashed by radicals and agitators. Eleanor spoke for the first time since Victoria's arrival, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Ashford, I never asked Victoria to leave your home. I begged her to stay, to accept the severance you offered, to live the life you had planned for her. She chose this path herself. Because you taught her to think, Richard spat. You filled her head with dangerous ideas. I taught her to read, Eleanor replied calmly. I taught her to question. I taught her that every human being deserves dignity and respect. If those are dangerous ideas, then perhaps the danger lies not in the ideas themselves, but in the systems that find them threatening. Richard looked between them, seeing for the first time the true nature of their bond. It wasn't the relationship of servant and mistress, nor even simply teacher and student. It was a partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and shared values. It was everything his world insisted was impossible. The inheritance, he said finally, defeated. Your mother's trust. You're entitled to it. Victoria shook her head. I don't want it. Donate it to schools that serve black children. Use it to fund scholarships for girls who want to become teachers. Do something that would have made Mother proud. Your mother would have wanted you to have it, Richard insisted. My mother, Victoria said softly, would have wanted me to be happy. And I am, Father. For the first time in my life, I'm truly happy. Richard Ashford left Chicago that evening without his daughter, but with something he hadn't expected, a glimpse of a world he had spent his entire life denying. The train ride back to Connecticut was the longest of his life, filled with uncomfortable reflections and unwelcome truths. In the months that followed, something shifted in Richard Ashford. He began asking questions about his business practices, examining the foundations of his fortune with eyes that could no longer ignore the injustices Victoria had named. He established a foundation in his late wife's name, funding exactly the causes Victoria had suggested. He revised lending policies at his banks, implemented fair wage standards at his factories. It wasn't redemption, exactly. The damage of a lifetime couldn't be undone by a few months of reform, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor of his certainty. 3 years later, Richard received an invitation to Victoria's wedding. She was marrying James Crawford, a black professor of philosophy she had met through Eleanor's academic circles. The ceremony would be held in Chicago, in a church that welcomed all races. Eleanor would be the maid of honor. Richard Ashford stood in the back of that church, watching his daughter marry a man he would never have approved of in his former life. He watched Eleanor stand beside Victoria, their bond as visible as any blood relation. He watched the congregation, a rainbow of faces united in celebration, and felt the weight of everything he had been taught about the natural order of society crumble completely. After the ceremony, Victoria approached him, radiant in a simple white dress. "Thank you for coming," she said. Richard's eyes were wet. "I've been a fool," he managed, "about so many things." Victoria took his hand. "We're all fools until we learn better, Father. The question is what we do with that knowledge once we have it." "I want to know you," Richard said. "Your real life, not the one I tried to force on you. I want to understand what makes you happy." Victoria smiled, the same smile that had lit up his life when she was a child. "Then come to dinner next Sunday. Eleanor is making her famous pot roast, and James wants to discuss his new book with you. Fair warning, it's about dismantling economic systems of oppression." Richard laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. "I suppose I should start somewhere." In the years that followed, Richard Ashford became an unlikely advocate for social reform. His name, once synonymous with old money conservatism, began appearing on progressive causes. He funded schools, supported fair housing initiatives, and used his considerable influence to open doors that had been closed to people of color. He never moved to Chicago, but he visited often, becoming a fixture at Sunday dinners in Victoria and James's home, where Eleanor was always present, her sharp wit and sharper intellect challenging him to think beyond the boundaries of his upbringing. On his 70th birthday, Richard sat in Victoria's parlor, now expanded after James's book had become a bestseller, surrounded by grandchildren who called Eleanor Aunt Ellie and saw nothing strange in the family they had created. His daughter was happy, successful, living a life of purpose and meaning. Eleanor had published her work under her own name, finally, becoming a respected voice in education reform. "You know," Richard said to Eleanor as they watched Victoria organize the birthday celebration, When I hired you 25 years ago, I thought I was getting a nanny. Someone to mind the child while I built my empire. Eleanor smiled, and instead you got someone who would teach her to question that empire. Richard nodded slowly. I was so angry when she left. I thought you had stolen her from me. And now, Eleanor asked. Now I realize she was never mine to keep. She was her own person, and you helped her understand that. He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. Thank you, Eleanor, for giving my daughter what I couldn't, the freedom to become herself. Eleanor's eyes glistened. She gave that to herself, Mr. Ashford. I just held the mirror. As the party continued around them, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had lost a daughter and gained her back, transformed. He had lost his certainty and gained wisdom. He had lost his prejudices and gained a family that defied every convention he had once held sacred. The lesson he had learned, painfully and slowly, was one that Victoria and Eleanor had understood all along. Love doesn't recognize the boundaries society tries to impose. Family isn't defined by blood or race or social standing. Dignity isn't a privilege to be granted, but a right to be respected. When Victoria called everyone to gather for the birthday toast, Richard stood surrounded by the family he never could have imagined. A white daughter and black son-in-law, grandchildren of mixed race, and Eleanor, the woman who had started it all by daring to treat a child as a whole person worthy of respect and education. This, Richard thought, looking around at the faces filled with genuine love and acceptance, this is what I was too blind to see. This is what I almost destroyed in my arrogance. This is what my daughter and Eleanor built from the ashes of my rejection. Victoria raised her glass. To Father, who proved that it's never too late to learn to change, to become better than you were. As they drank, Richard caught Eleanor's eye across the room. She nodded slightly, a gesture of forgiveness and acknowledgement. They would never be friends, exactly. The wounds of the past, the years of servitude and dismissal, couldn't be completely erased. But they had reached an understanding, built on mutual respect for the woman they both loved. That night, as Richard prepared to return to Connecticut, Victoria walked him to his car. The Chicago streets were quiet, the spring air soft with the promise of renewal. I'm proud of you, Father, she said simply, for being willing to change. Richard embraced his daughter, feeling the strength in her arms, the confidence in her bearing. I'm proud of you too, he whispered, for having the courage to leave and the grace to let me back in. As his car pulled away, Richard looked back to see Victoria and Eleanor standing together in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light of home. They had built something extraordinary, these two women, a life that honored both of them completely. They had defied society's expectations and created their own definition of family, love, and belonging. Richard Ashford had spent his life believing he knew how the world worked, who belonged where, what was proper and right. His daughter and her nanny had taught him that the world was far more beautiful and complex than his narrow vision had allowed. They had taught him that love transcends race, that family is built on choice and commitment rather than blood, that dignity is inherent rather than earned. The story of Victoria Ashford and Eleanor Chambers would be whispered about in Connecticut society for generations, a scandal that never quite faded. But in Chicago, among the progressive educators and activists who knew them, they were simply two remarkable women who had chosen each other, built a life together, and changed everyone they touched. And Richard Ashford, the millionaire who had tried to separate them, became in the end their unlikely ally, proof that even the most hardened prejudices can crack when confronted with the undeniable truth of love and human dignity.